The call came through while I was standing in the middle of the council chamber, watching Secretary General Vothkreel sign a trade authorization that would give the Valori Syndicate exclusive rights to 3 asteroid belts that human miners had worked for 40 years. Nobody looked at me. They never did. My name is Carter Lane. I have been Earth's diplomatic representative aboard Aetherian Prime for 9 years. I sit at a long curved table with 46 other delegates from 46 other species, and for 9 years, I have watched every motion I raised get voted down, every concern I filed get rerouted to a committee that never met, and every word I spoke get translated, summarized, and quietly ignored. The Valori delegate, a tall creature with pale violet skin and 4 articulated fingers on each hand, glanced at me once during the signing. The look was not hostile. It was something worse. It was the look you give a piece of furniture. My earpiece buzzed. I recognized the frequency. It was the emergency relay from the human colonial network. I kept my face still, the way you learn to keep it still, after 9 years of losing gracefully in rooms full of people who consider your losing to be the natural order of things. I stepped out of the chamber. The corridor was empty. I pressed the receive key. The voice on the other end was calm, which made it worse. It was Colony Administrator Nell Ford, from Verade 4. Her voice had the particular flatness of someone who had been crying for a long time, and had no more left to cry. She told me what had happened. She told me the time. She told me the council strike authorization number, because she had found it in the wreckage of the colony's administrative office. Someone had filed it. Someone had signed it. There was a paper trail, neat and bureaucratic and damning, and it had ended with a medical ward full of injured colonists and a child named Mara Okafor, 9 years old, who had been brought in that morning with a broken arm from a fall off a climbing frame, and who did not survive the strike because she was in the wrong building at the wrong time, when the council decided that Verada 4's unlicensed water reclamation project constituted an act of civil non-compliance. A broken arm. She had gone to the medical ward for a broken arm. I stood in the corridor of Aetherian Prime and listened to Nell Ford read me the details of a reparations credit that the council had already processed and transferred to the colony's account. 4,000 galactic marks. The automated system had flagged Mara Okafor as civilian collateral. Category B, standard compensation. Case closed. I said nothing for a long moment. The air recyclers hummed above me. Somewhere down the corridor, a Valori administrator laughed at something. Nell Ford asked me what we were going to do. I had been waiting for 9 years for someone to ask me that question, and mean it the way she meant it now. Not as a political inquiry, not as a diplomatic maneuver, but as a human being, asking another human being what we were actually going to do about the fact that a 9-year-old girl with a broken arm was dead, and the institution responsible had already processed it as a line item. I told Nell Ford that I would handle it. I went back to my quarters. I did not go back to the chamber. I sat down at my personal communication terminal, the one with the encryption layer that no council monitoring system had ever been able to read, because human engineers had built the encryption around a mathematical structure that the council's best analysts had spent decades calling too simple to be worth investigating. It is a very human trick. Hide the important things inside what looks obvious. I opened a channel to the Earth diplomatic office. I typed 4 words, just 4. They were not dramatic words. They were plain and functional, the kind of words you would find in any administrative document. But every human official above a certain clearance level had been trained since childhood to recognize them, the way you recognize a fire alarm not because of what it says but because of what it means. I typed, invoke Article 9, Verada. I pressed send. Then I waited. The response came in 6 minutes. 6 minutes is very fast for a message traveling the relay distance between Aetherian Prime and Earth. It told me that the response had been prepared and waiting. It told me that someone back home had known, or suspected, or had been ready, and had kept something warm for exactly this kind of moment. The response was an audio file. I put in my earpiece and played it. It was a low, sustained horn tone, long and even, with no variation. Every human child who has ever lived in a colonial settlement or an Earth city knows that sound. It is the evacuation signal. It means, leave what you are doing and move to safety, because something serious is coming. Except this time, as the message header confirmed, it was not being played as a warning to civilians. It was being played as a notification. I sat in my quarters on Etherian Prime and listened to the horn and understood that something that had been sleeping for a very long time had just been told to wake up. I did not feel powerful. I did not feel righteous. I felt tired and sad and certain, the way you feel when you have been patient for so long that patience itself becomes its own kind of grief, and then the moment finally comes, and all that grief has somewhere to go. I thought about Mara Okafor. I thought about what she had looked like in the colony register photograph that Nell Ford had sent along with the administrative report. A girl in a red jacket with 2 front teeth missing, and her hair pulled back in a style that her mother probably did for her every morning. 9 years old. A broken arm. The wrong building. I thought about her mother, Dr. Senna Okafor, who ran the medical ward that her daughter had been brought to, and who had been off-site at a supply run when the strike hit, and who had come back to find what she found. 4,000 marks. Case closed. Outside my window, the stars of the outer veil were cold and very far away. I looked at them for a while. Then I composed myself, put my earpiece back in, and began drafting the most important diplomatic communication I would ever send in my life. It was a formal request, precisely worded, citing Article 9 of the original Accord of Silence, the clause that had been buried in the treaty's 14th addendum and that no council legal team had ever taken seriously because no human diplomat had ever tried to use it. The clause stated, in language as dry and careful as a land deed, that any signatory nation retaining the right to recall peacekeeping assets in response to confirmed civilian harm without accountability may do so by formal notification of the Secretary General within 72 hours of the triggering event. The triggering event had a name. Her name was Mara. She liked mango rice and climbing frames, and she had 2 front teeth missing, and she was 9 years old. I hit send on the formal notification. Then I went and made myself a cup of tea, because there was nothing else to do but wait, and I had gotten very good at waiting. But this was the last time. The gravity alarms on Etherian Prime went off at 0340 station time, which is the darkest and quietest hour on a station that never truly sleeps. I was already awake. I had been awake since I sent the notification. I had been sitting at my window with my cold tea and watching the stars, and when the alarms began their low cycling pulse, I did not jump. I simply set down the cup. Within 4 minutes, the emergency alert system had routed every senior delegate to the council's main monitoring floor, a wide circular room, 3 levels below the chamber, with walls of sensor displays, and a central holographic projection table that could render real-time positional data from anywhere in council-monitored space. I arrived and took my place at the outer ring of the room, where human delegates were permitted to stand, but not to operate any of the console interfaces without council approval. Vothkreel was already there. He was a broad, gray-skinned being with deep-set optical organs that picked up frequencies humans could not see, and he had the particular posture of someone who had just been pulled from sleep and was furious about it. He looked at the displays. He looked at me. He looked back at the displays. On the screens, 37 separate gravity anomalies had appeared simultaneously across a region of space known informally as the Outer Veil, a stretch of mapped but largely ignored territory on the far edge of council jurisdiction. It was dead space, commercially worthless, too distant from trade lanes to be useful, and too sparse for settlement. The council's deep space monitoring network had been pinging it for decades and returning the same result every time: nothing. Now the network was returning something very different. The signatures were massive, not the kind of massive that comes from a natural object drifting into a sensor range, but the particular dense, structured gravity signature that every species with spacefaring technology recognizes immediately, because it is the signature of something large, made of something deliberate, and it is moving. My colleague, Sethahara, a Valorian science attaché, with whom I had worked for 6 years, and who was one of the few beings on the station who consistently treated me as though my words had weight, crossed the room and put her long fingers on my arm. She was not a small being. She stood nearly 2 meters tall, and her skin had gone the pale color it turned when she was frightened. She said very quietly, "Carter, do you know what those are?" I said yes. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, even more quietly, "How long have they been there?" I said, "A while." She stepped back. She did not let go of my arm. I think she needed something to hold on to. What was appearing on the screens was not something that had arrived in the night. What was appearing on the screens had been there for 80 years, and every human diplomat and official and engineer who had been briefed above a certain clearance level had known it was there, and had known what it was waiting for, and had spent 80 years hoping, very quietly and very sincerely, that the moment would never come. Let me explain what happened after the Accord of Silence. The accord was signed 83 years ago, at the end of what the Council called the First Contact Conflict, and what humans called the Border War. Humanity had expanded into space, with the particular energetic chaos of a species that had survived its own planet long enough to get off it, and the Council had found us alarming, not because we were unusually powerful. We were not, at that point, a match for the combined military capacity of even 3 Council member species. What alarmed them was the way we fought. We adapted, quickly. Every engagement, every loss, we changed something. The Council was accustomed to wars that had predictable shapes. His human warfare did not have a predictable shape. It had a direction, and the direction was always forward. So they offered terms: membership in the Galactic Council, access to trade networks, diplomatic standing, legal protection for human colonies under Council Charter. In exchange, Earth would decommission its warfleet and submit to the Accord's arms limitation framework. Earth agreed. What Earth did not explain, because the Council did not ask specifically enough, was what decommission meant. The engineers called it the long sleep doctrine. It was developed in the final 3 months of the Accord negotiations, quietly, by a team of 11 people who believed, based on 3,000 years of human political history, that any institution given unchecked authority over a less powerful member would eventually use that authority carelessly. They were not cynics. They were historians. There is a difference. The warships were not destroyed. They were put into deep hibernation. Their reactor cores cooled to minimal function. Their systems locked into low-power maintenance cycles that could sustain them for centuries. And then they were hidden. Not in hangars, not in orbit. They were seeded into the cores of gas giants, tucked into the mantles of rogue planets, lowered into the crushing dark interiors of ice dwarfs, places where no routine survey would ever find them, because no routine survey went that deep into objects that had no commercial value. 37 ships, the finest the human fleet had produced before the Accord, each one named, registered, and technically decommissioned in the official documentation that the Council received and filed, and never examined closely again. And then, for 80 years, while the Council conducted its business and voted down human motions and authorized pacification strikes and processed colonial casualties as line items, Earth's engineers sent quiet signals, one patch at a time, one system upgrade at a time, disguised as civilian navigation updates, encoded in the carrier frequencies of commercial broadcast arrays, formatted to look like routine maintenance pings from orbital weather platforms. Each ship received each update and incorporated it and went back to sleep. And over 80 years, 3 full generations of weapons technology had been quietly, incrementally, and completely installed into hulls that the Council believed were cold and dead. They were not cold. They were not dead. They were waiting. And now, at 0340 on Etherian Prime, they were waking up. Voth Creel demanded answers. The monitoring floor had erupted with noise, a dozen species all talking at once in a dozen languages, their translators struggling to keep up. Voth Creel cut through it by sheer volume and stood at the central table and looked directly at me. "Lane," he said, "explain these contacts." I walked to the center of the room. I put my hands in my pockets. I had rehearsed this moment many times in the privacy of my own mind over the years, in the way you rehearse things you hope you will never need to say. I had always imagined feeling something dramatic, anger perhaps, or cold satisfaction. What I actually felt was tired and clear, the way the air feels after a long rain. I said, "Those are Earth's vessels, responding to a lawful distress notification filed under Article 9 of the Accord of Silence." The room went quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet, when the thing being said is too large to process immediately. I said, "Article 9 states that any signatory retaining peacekeeping assets may recall those assets in response to confirmed civilian harm, without accountability, by formal notification to the Secretary General within 72 hours of the triggering event." I filed that notification 14 hours ago. It is logged in the Council's own receipt system. You can check. Voss Creel stared at me. He had the look of someone doing very fast math and not liking the result. The Valori science lead, a quick-minded being named Aerith Sol, who I had always respected for her intellectual honesty, even when she voted against every motion I raised, pulled up the Accord documentation on her console. I watched her read it. I watched her face change. She had read the Accord many times. Everyone in this room had, but Article 9 was in the 14th addendum, buried between a clause about commercial shipping rights and a clause about atmospheric sampling protocols. It was written in the dry, careful language of lawyers who understood that the most important things should never look important. Nobody had taken it seriously because nobody had believed a human diplomat would ever actually invoke it. Because to invoke it, you had to have something to invoke it with. On the screens, the 37 contacts were resolving into clearer shapes as they emerged from the gas giants and ice dwarfs that had sheltered them. They were dark, no running lights, smooth hulls with none of the visible exhaust systems or sensor arrays that council vessels used, because human engineers had spent 80 years making those systems internal, invisible, designed not for display but for function. They looked wrong in the way that things look wrong when they are more capable than you expected. They moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, like something that had been asleep for a long time and had no need to hurry now that it was awake. A Valorian technician at one of the consoles said, very quietly, that the sensor returns on the lead vessel were inconsistent with any known hull configuration, and that the weapon's signature reading was either a sensor malfunction or a classification level that did not exist under the current council registry. It was not a sensor malfunction. The technician looked at me. I looked back at her. I did not explain. And then the lead ship opened a hailing frequency to Etherian Prime, and the voice that came through the speakers was calm and level and human. This is Admiral Commander Raoult Okafor of the Earth Heritage ship, Mara's name, operating under Article 9, Recall Authorization, filed and logged. We are in council space on a lawful response mission. Please clear a diplomatic channel for formal communication. The monitoring floor was completely silent. I knew that name. Everyone in the human command structure knew that name. Raoult Okafor was the finest combat commander Earth had produced in 50 years, and she was Mara's aunt, Dr. Senna Okafor's older sister. She had been the first person Senna called when she came back from the supply run and found what was left of the medical ward, and she had spent every hour since that call doing what she had prepared for, in secret, over a career that nobody outside a very small circle knew the full shape of. The ship was named Mara's name because Raoult had named it the moment the recall signal reached the fleet. She had done it in the transit, while the ships were rising from their long sleep through kilometers of gas and pressure and cold, while their systems were cycling up and their crews were coming out of the cryo-rest that had kept them ready across the months of standby alert. She had named it that, and she had logged it in the ship's registry, and she had not asked anyone's permission. Vothkreel turned to me. His voice was very carefully controlled, which meant he was not controlled at all. He said, "Those ships are in violation of every clause of the disarmament framework." I said, "Those ships were decommissioned in full compliance with the Accord. The Accord required decommission. It did not define decommission as destruction. And it contained no maintenance prohibition, because your legal team did not think to include one. They have been upgraded. They have been maintained. That is not the same thing." I looked at him steadily. "No, it is not." He looked at the screens. 37 ships moving through the outer veil in slow, deliberate formation, crossing toward council space with no lights, and no noise, and no urgency whatsoever. A fleet that the council had believed was dead. A fleet that had been sleeping in the dark for 80 years, being quietly made more capable with every passing decade. I said, "The Secretary General will want to open a formal channel to Admiral Okafor. I would recommend doing that soon." Vothkreel said nothing. On the screens, the Mara's name moved forward at the head of the formation, steady and dark and without any visible weapons deployed, just present, just real, just there, in a way that 37 ships that size could not help but be, no matter how quietly they moved. Sethara was still standing near me. She spoke without looking away from the screens. She said, "They're not in attack formation." I said, "No." She said, "What formation is that?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about 9 years of being voted down. I thought about 11 colonial strikes buried in Tier 7 files. I thought about a 9-year-old girl, and a medical ward, and 4,000 marks. I said. That's what patience looks like when it runs out. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very softly, I'm sorry, Carter. About the child. It was the first time, in 9 years, that any non-human delegate had said those words to me, without being prompted by a procedural courtesy requirement. I said, her name was Mara. Zephora said, Mara. She said it like she was learning it, like she intended to remember it. On the screens, the fleet kept coming. The Council's combined defensive formation assembled in 11 hours, which was the fastest mobilization the Galactic Council had achieved in 30 years. 412 vessels from 14 member species, organized into 3 concentric rings around Etherian Prime, with long-range interdiction arrays charged and short-range point systems online. It was genuinely impressive. The Council knew how to move when it was frightened. It was also, I knew, completely irrelevant. I stood at the observation gallery above the main chamber and watched the tactical displays. The human fleet had not accelerated. It had not changed formation. It had not powered any weapons systems to active status, which the Council's sensors would have detected immediately. 37 ships moved through Council space at a measured, unhurried pace, and what the Council's analysts were finding, as they ran their assessments with increasing urgency, was that they could not get a clean read on what those ships were actually capable of. The hulls absorbed sensor pings in ways that current Council technology was not designed to account for. The power signatures were clean, but massive, far beyond what the ship's registered tonnage should have been able to generate. And the weapons systems, when the Council's deep scan arrays finally penetrated far enough to get a reading, returned classifications that the Council's own registry simply did not have a category for. Admiral Okafor had not threatened anyone. She had requested a diplomatic channel, been given one, and had spent the first 4 hours of contact speaking exclusively with me and with the Council's head of the External Relations Office, a methodical Cathani diplomat named Vorsal, who was very good at staying calm in situations where calm was difficult. She had provided all requested documentation. She had cited every applicable clause. She had been, in every formal sense, completely cooperative, and she had named every ship in the fleet after the first hour of contact, broadcasting the list on open frequency so that every vessel and station within range could receive it. 37 names. The Mara's name was the flagship. Behind it came the Senna, the Verada Morning, the Nelford, the Broken Arm, and 32 others, each one named for a person, or a place, or a fact, connected to what had happened on Verada 4. The Council found this disturbing. I found it appropriate. Vothkreel had convened an emergency full session. All 46 delegates were present, which had not happened in my 9 years. I took my seat at the human table, and was aware, for the first time, that people were looking at me, not past me, not through me, at me. Vothkreel opened the session with a formal motion to classify the human fleet's presence as an act of military aggression and authorize a defensive response. I stood up before he finished reading the motion. I said, "Point of procedural order." And he looked at me with the expression of someone who had never needed to take my procedural objections seriously and was recalibrating very quickly. I said, "A defensive response to what, specifically? The fleet has deployed no weapons. It has committed no hostile act. It has filed all required notifications and is operating under a clause of the accord that this body ratified 83 years ago. If the Council authorizes a strike on ships that have done nothing except exist in lawful recall formation, that action will be logged, recorded, and broadcast on the same open frequency that Admiral Okafor has been using. Every species with a receiver in this region of space will hear it." I paused. Then I said, "I would also note that Admiral Okafor has been very careful not to threaten anyone. She has simply asked a question. I believe the Secretary General should answer it." Vothkreel said, very carefully, "What question?" I said, "When the channel first opened, her first words were, 'Do you know her name?' I think the session should formally answer that question before taking any other action." The chamber was quiet. Vorsal, the Cathani diplomat, spoke from across the table. His voice was level. "Whose name?" I said. "Mara Okafor, 9 years old, colony of Verada 4. She was in the medical ward for a broken arm." Vorsal looked down at the table. He was a careful being, methodical, someone who read every document he was given. I watched him processing what I had just said, connecting it to the strike authorization number that I had formally filed in my Article 9 notification, which every delegate in this room had received a copy of 14 hours ago. I said, she liked mango rice. Her mother made it on Sundays. She had 2 front teeth missing. She had gone to the medical ward that morning for a broken arm, and she did not come back out. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, the council processed her as civilian collateral, Category B, 4,000 marks. Case closed. I would like the session to formally consider whether that was an adequate accounting. Vothkreel said, this is not the appropriate format for a grief proceeding. I said, no, it is the appropriate format for a reckoning. Those are different things. The vote on the military response motion failed. It needed a 3/4 majority to pass immediately, and it got less than half. The species that voted against it were not all there out of sympathy for humans. Some of them had their own colonial settlements. Some of them had read the Article 9 notification carefully and noticed that the clause did not restrict its use to human colonies. Some of them were doing the same math I had done 9 years ago, and arriving at the same conclusion I had arrived at, which was that an institution that processes children as line items will eventually process any child as a line item, regardless of species. The Council's defensive fleet held position. The human fleet held position. For 6 hours, nothing happened except communication, which is frequently the most important thing that can happen. Admiral Okafor opened a full broadcast on the Galactic common frequency at the top of the 7th hour, not a Council channel. The open frequency, every ship, every station, every receiver in range. She read Mara Okafor's name. She read her age. She read the date and time of the strike. She read the strike authorization number and the names of the 3 Council officials who had signed it. She read the medical report, which Nelford had transmitted in full, and which described a broken arm, a standard stabilization procedure, and a prognosis of full recovery. She read the reparations credit amount and the case classification. She read all of it, slowly and evenly, in a voice that did not crack and did not rush, for 11 minutes. Then she said her name was Mara. She was 9 years old. She is not a line item. She is not a case number. She is a name that I intend to make certain this council never forgets, for as long as this council exists. Then she went quiet. On the tactical displays, I watched something that I had not expected, though perhaps I should have. 6 ships broke from the council's defensive formation. Not human ships. A pair of Cathani patrol vessels and 4 Therian escorts. All of them small. All of them from species with colonial settlements in the outer regions. They did not move toward the human fleet. They simply moved away from the council formation and held position, neutral, in the space between. 6 ships out of 412 is not a military shift, but it is something. It is the first visible crack in a wall, and walls with cracks in them behave differently from walls without. I was watching the displays when Vorsal appeared beside me. He stood quietly for a moment. Then he said, "The council will want to discuss terms." I said, "I know." He said, "What does humanity actually want from this?" I thought about 9 years of being voted down. I thought about 11 strikes buried in Tier 7 files that I had been sitting on for 6 years, waiting, hoping I would never need to use them. I thought about Nelford's flat, exhausted voice, reading me the reparations credit over a relay channel at midnight station time. I said, accountability, full, public, binding, and permanent, and a new accord, written by people who have something to lose. Vorsal was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That will be difficult." I said, "So is raising a child on a colony world, and watching the institution that is supposed to protect her, treat her death as an administrative expense." He said nothing to that. On the screens, the Mara's name sat at the head of the human formation, dark and enormous and patient, while the Council's defensive fleet held its rings, and the 6 ships drifted in neutral space between them, and somewhere across the relay network, a galaxy's worth of receivers were playing back 11 minutes of a woman's steady voice, reading a dead child's name into the open frequency. The Council's request for a formal negotiation session came through 40 minutes later. I accepted on behalf of Earth. I walked back to the main chamber, and for the first time in 9 years, when I sat down at the human table, every delegate in the room was already looking at where I was going to sit. The negotiation session was held in the Council's closed mediation chamber, a smaller room off the main floor with no public gallery and a strict no-broadcast protocol. 14 delegates were present, representing the 9 largest member species plus Earth. Vor-Sal chaired. I was the only human in the room. Admiral Okafor held formation outside. We had agreed she would not attend the session. Not because she was not capable of it, because her presence would have been a pressure, and I did not want the Council negotiating under the shadow of the fleet. I wanted them negotiating under the weight of the truth, which is heavier and harder to escape. Voth Creel opened with the Council's first offer, a scaled reparations package for Verada 4, a formal apology resolution to be entered into the Council record, and the removal from office of the 3 officials who had signed the strike authorization. He presented it as generous. He used the word comprehensive 3 times. He was watching my face very carefully while he spoke. I listened to all of it. I let him finish. Then I said no. He asked why. I said, because what you are offering is a ceiling. You are offering the maximum amount you are willing to give, framed as the first position in a negotiation, hoping I will accept it and let you close the file. But the file does not close with money, or with 3 officials losing their positions. The file closes when the structure that produced the decision is changed, so that the decision cannot be made the same way again. Vor-Sal asked what structure I meant. I said, the Tier 7 Administrative Review designation, the classification that allows the Council to seal strike authorizations from member species oversight indefinitely. I want it abolished. The room shifted, not in the way rooms shift when someone says something shocking, in the way rooms shift when someone says something that everyone present was hoping would not be said. The delegate from the Keth Alliance, a sharp-minded individual named Aravel, who had been on the Council for 30 years, said, the Tier 7 designation exists to protect ongoing security operations from disclosure. I said, I know what it exists for officially. I also know what it has been used for actually. I opened my data slate. I slid it across the table to Vor-Sal. I said, those are the Council strike records from the past 40 years. Not the public ones, the sealed ones. There are 11 of them. 9 involve non-human colonies. None of them were ever brought to a full session floor. All of them were sealed under Tier 7 and classified as internal administrative actions. I have had these for 6 years. Vor-Sal looked at the slate. He did not pick it up immediately. He looked at it, the way you look at something you have been half expecting and fully dreading. Aravel said, very carefully, where did you obtain those records? I said, from the Council's own archive system, through a data access channel that was technically available to senior diplomatic staff, but that nobody had used before, because nobody thought to look. I looked. I paused. I have looked at a great many things over 9 years. I had a great deal of time. Vor-Sal finally picked up the slate. He began reading. The room was very quiet. What happened in the next 20 minutes was the kind of thing that is very hard to describe, because it is not dramatic in any visible way. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody left the room. What happened was that 14 beings who held enormous institutional power sat in a sealed chamber and read a document that showed them, in precise and dated detail, that the institution they had served had been doing something terrible and had been hiding it, and that they had not known, and that their not knowing had not protected them from being complicit. The Therian delegate, a being named Isaratel who I had met twice before at formal events, and who had always been politely dismissive toward me, set down her copy of the document and was silent for a very long time. Then she said, in a voice that was careful in the way that voices are careful when they are carrying something they cannot put down, the colony strike of 38 years ago, the one classified as a mining accident, the Therian settlement on Borath Station. I said, yes. She said, my people were told it was an equipment failure. We filed for damages through the standard compensation system. We were given a settlement and a report. We never saw the original authorization. I said, no, you would not have. It was sealed 14 days after the event and reclassified under Tier 7 in a classification that was signed by a council administrator who retired with full honors 4 years later. Isaratel looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at Voth Creel. She said, I would like to see the original authorization for the Borath Station event. Voth Creel said nothing. She said, louder, Secretary General, I would like to see the original authorization. The negotiation broke for 90 minutes after that, because 3 delegations needed to consult with their home governments. I went to the small anteroom adjacent to the mediation chamber and sat down with a glass of water and did nothing. I was tired. I was more tired than I had been in a long time, but it was a different kind of tired than the 9-year exhaustion of being ignored. This was the tired that comes after something difficult and necessary is finished, or at least is nearly finished. Vorsal came to find me during the break. He sat down across from me. He was a quiet person by nature, careful with words, someone who spoke only when he had thought through what he wanted to say. He said, "The Therian delegation has suspended its council membership pending review." I said I had expected something like that. He said, "The Keth Alliance is considering the same. 3 other species are in contact with their governments." I said, "I know." He said, "The council as it currently exists may not survive this." I said, "The council as it currently exists should not survive this. What should survive is the idea of a galactic governing body with genuine accountability, fair representation, and a legal framework that applies equally to its most powerful members and its least powerful ones. That is what should survive. Whether it is called the council or something else does not matter to me." Vorsal said, "That will take years to build." I said, "Good things usually do." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Was the fleet always going to come?" I said, "The fleet came because a child died, and the institution responsible treated it as a paperwork issue. Whether it would have come for something else, I cannot say." He said, "But it exists, and now we know it exists." I said, "Yes." He said, "That changes the calculation permanently, even if the ships go back to sleep tomorrow." I said, "That is correct. It changes the calculation permanently. That is, to be precise, the point." He looked at me for a while. He had old eyes. Vorsal. The eyes of someone who had spent a very long time watching how things actually worked beneath how they were supposed to work. He said, "I believe you would have preferred not to need to do this." I said, "I spent 9 years at that table hoping I would never need to do this. I raised motions. I filed reports. I asked questions in chambers. I voted against strike authorizations and was overruled every single time. I did everything the process gave me to do." I stopped. "And then the process killed a 9-year-old girl and sent her mother 4,000 marks." Vorsal said nothing. I said, "I would have preferred, very much, not to need to do this." He nodded. He stood up. Before he left, he said, "What was she like?" "The child. If you know." I said, "I never met her. But her mother told Administrator Ford that she was loud and curious, and absolutely fearless about climbing things she was not supposed to climb. She had decided she was going to be a doctor like her mother. She had recently informed the family that mango rice was her favorite food, and that she would like it for every meal." Vorsal stood in the doorway for a moment. He said, very softly, "Mara." I said, "Mara Okafor." He left. I sat with my water for a while longer. Somewhere outside, 37 ships waited in the dark, named for things that should never have needed naming. The resumed session lasted 4 more hours. When it ended, the framework of the Verada Accord had been agreed in principle by 11 of the 14 delegations present, with the remaining 3 abstaining rather than opposing, which in council procedural language is a form of quiet consent. The Accord's first clause required that all strike authorizations targeting civilian areas be subject to full open council vote, logged in the public record, non-classifiable under any designation, permanently. The second clause abolished the Tier 7 administrative review system and mandated that all sealed records from the past 50 years be reviewed by a joint commission, including representatives from every affected species. The third clause established a new representation weighting system that gave proportional voice to smaller member species. And in the preamble, at the request of Dr. Senna Okafor, transmitted to me through Nell Ford by relay message during the final hour of negotiation, the Accord recorded a single name. Mara Okafor, 9 years old, Verada-4 colony. Not a case number, not a line item, a name. In the opening paragraph of a binding galactic document, permanent and public and impossible to seal. I signed it, on behalf of Earth. 6 months after the signing, I went to Verada-4 for the first time. I had seen it in images, in the colonial registry records, in the administrative reports that had been filed and ignored for years. I knew its geography, and its population numbers, and its official designation. but I had not been there. I had been on Etherian Prime for 9 years, sitting at a table, and Verada 4 had been a name in documents. It looked like a place where people had decided to stay. The colony had been rebuilt with resources that Earth sent in the months after the Accord signing. New buildings were up, the agricultural fields were under cultivation again. The water reclamation project, the one the Council had called non-compliant, had been certified and legalized under the new framework, and it was running at full capacity, and the colony's water quality was the best it had been in 20 years. Nell Ford met me at the landing pad. She was a compact, quiet person with steady hands and the kind of face that had spent a lot of time holding difficult things. She shook my hand and said, "Welcome to Verada 4, Delegate Lane." And I said, "Carter, please." She showed me around. We walked through the rebuilt sections, where people nodded when they saw us. Nobody made a large thing of it. Colonists are practical. They had work to do, and they did it, and they had a complicated relationship with the larger political events that had turned their settlement into the name on a historic document. Some of them were grateful. Some of them were still very much in the middle of grieving, and gratitude had not fully arrived yet. Dr. Senna Okafor was in the medical ward. It was a new ward, larger than the old one, with better equipment and a treatment capacity that could serve the full colony population without strain. She was reviewing supply inventory when Nell Ford brought me in. She looked up. She was a tall woman with precise, careful movements and eyes that had the particular quality of someone who had learned to function fully and normally around a grief that was not going to leave. She shook my hand. She thanked me. She did not say too much, and I did not say too much, because we both understood that most of what had happened between us had already been said, or was not the kind of thing that could be said. She showed me the ward, and on the far wall, near the entrance, was a mural. The children of the colony had painted it. It covered most of the wall. It showed a girl in a red jacket, standing in an open field, on a planet that was clearly Verada 4, with the particular reddish grass that grew in the lower elevations. The girl had 2 front teeth missing, and she was holding a piece of fruit that could only be a mango, and she was looking up, and in the sky above her, filling the upper half of the mural in dark, careful strokes, was a fleet of ships. 37 of them, painted with the patient, particular attention of children who had been told what those ships had done, and had put them in the sky above the girl, as carefully and seriously as if they were putting them there themselves. The ships in the mural were not facing the colony. They were facing outward, away, toward the horizon, their hulls dark and their lines long, and their presence in the painted sky absolute and permanent. I stood in front of it for a long time. Dr. Okafor stood beside me. After a while she said, "The children asked to do it. We gave them the wall and the paint, and they spent 3 days on it." She paused. "They said they wanted her to have guards." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "She does." We went outside afterward. Nell Ford had arranged a simple lunch with the Colonial Council, the practical kind of meeting, where people eat and discuss water rights, and crop rotations and supply schedules, which is most of what running a colony actually consists of. I sat at the table and listened to the conversation around me, and ate the food that was put in front of me, and at one point, I realized that what I was feeling was something I had not felt in a very long time. I was sitting at a table where my presence had weight, where what I said mattered to the people in the room because of what they knew I had done, and what they trusted I would continue to do, not because of any title or procedure or diplomatic protocol, because of something simpler and more basic than any of that. I took a supply shuttle back to the orbital relay station 2 days later. Admiral Okafor was there. She was not in uniform. She had been on leave since the Accord signing, a leave that she had described in her official communication as the first leave she had taken in 16 years, and that she intended to use to sleep, which she had also apparently not done in some time. She was a compact, precise person with the kind of posture that does not entirely relax even on leave, and she had her sister's same quality of functional steadiness around a grief that was still present. We sat in the relay station's small public cafeteria and drank coffee, which was the one thing the station stocked in ample supply, and talked. I asked her if the fleet was back in the long sleep. She said yes. New positions, deeper cover than before. She said it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a storage arrangement. I said, "Do you think it will ever need to come out again?" She looked at her coffee for a moment. She said, "I am not optimistic." but I am patient. She looked up. We're very good at patient. I said, yes, we are. She said, how long do you think the accord will hold? I said, as long as the species who signed it keep remembering why they signed it, which means, as long as we keep reminding them. I paused. That is my job, more than it has ever been. She nodded. We were quiet for a while. The relay station hummed around us, traffic moving through on its routes, ships coming and going, the ordinary business of a galaxy that was, in most places, not in the middle of a historic restructuring. She said, Vorsal sent me a message last week. The Keth Review Commission published its first interim report on the sealed records. 6 more strikes they did not know about. 3 involved Kethany settlements. I said, I know. I received the same report. She said, it's going to be a long process. I said, yes. That is the nature of things that have been wrong for a long time. The undoing takes longer than the doing. She finished her coffee. She set the cup down. She said, do you ever think about what it would have been like if the accord had been written right the first time? If they had built the accountability in from the beginning? I thought about that. I thought about 9 years at a table. I thought about 11 buried files, and a Tier 7 designation, and 4,000 marks, and a case closed stamp. I said, sometimes. But then I think about the fact that we built something now, not instead of what should have been, in addition to what was lost. I paused. That is what we have. I try to hold it carefully. Yzult Okafor nodded. She stood up and shook my hand and said, safe travels, Carter. I said, you too, Admiral. She left. I sat with my coffee for another few minutes. Then I gathered my things and took the next shuttle to Etherian Prime, the new Galactic Assembly, which is what the body had renamed itself in the 3rd article of the Verada Accord, was holding its 2nd full session in 2 weeks. The chamber had been expanded. The representation table had been redesigned with the new weighting formula, which meant that the seats for smaller species were now full seats rather than observer positions, and the human table was no longer at the far end of the curve, where the acoustics made it easy to speak over. I arrived early, which I always did. I set my data slate on the table. I had new documents on it, new motions to raise, a proposal for an independent review commission with binding authority, an amendment to the Colonial Charter that would require all member species to report settlement data annually in a public registry, a formal inquiry request regarding compensation disparities in the existing reparations framework for the 9 non-human colonies that had been struck and buried in Tier 7. There was a great deal of work to do. A young Therian delegate was already in the chamber when I arrived. She could not have been more than a year into her posting. She had the look of someone who is still learning which rooms to take seriously and which ones to treat as theater, and she had not yet worked out which category this one was. She would. I had been the same way once. She noticed me come in and straightened up in the way young delegates do when someone with a longer record enters the room. I sat down. I arranged my things. She said, excuse me, Delegate Lane? I said, yes. She said carefully, is it true? About the ships? Said Earth hid them in planets? I said, yes. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, for 80 years? I said, for 80 years. She said slowly, why didn't you use them before, if you had them? It was the question I had been asked, in one form or another, many times since the accord signing, by journalists, by diplomats, by Vorsal in a quiet anteroom. I had given different versions of the answer depending on who was asking, and what they were ready to hear. This delegate was young, and she was asking sincerely, and she deserved the real answer. I said, because we were hoping we had found people worth trusting. She processed that. She said, and then? I looked at the empty seats around the table, which would fill in a few minutes with 46 delegates from 46 species, some of whom had signed the Verada Accord, and some of whom were still deciding what they believed, and some of whom were quietly doing the math on what a galaxy with genuine accountability would cost them. I said, and then we stopped hoping and started requiring. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I read the preamble of the accord. I said, yes? She said, the name in the preamble. Mara Okafor. I read about her. She paused. She was 9. I said, yes, she was 9. The young delegate looked at the table. She said, I will remember that. I said, good. That is the most important thing you will do in this room. The other delegates began to arrive. The chamber filled with voices and movement, and the ordinary complicated noise of a governing body assembling for business. I sat at my table and watched it, and felt, not for the first time, the strange weight of being in a place where the work is never finished, and the reasons for doing it are the only thing that keeps it from becoming just work. Somewhere, 37 ships slept in the dark, in gas giants and ice dwarfs and the cold mantles of rogue planets, suspended in the long patient quiet that humans had learned to use as well as any weapon. Their hulls bore new names now, names that would not come off. Names that every ship registry in the known galaxy had on record, permanent and public and impossible to seal. The session opened. I set my hands on the table, next to my data slate, and I looked at the chamber, and I thought, today might actually go differently. Not because the fleet was out there, not because the accord had been signed, but because in the preamble of a binding document that 41 species had ratified, a 9-year-old girl who had liked mango rice and climbing frames, and the idea of becoming a doctor like her mother, was not a case number, or a line item, or a Category B civilian collateral. She was a name, and now every delegate in this room had to look at that name every time they opened the accord, and remember what it cost, and do better. That is not everything. It is not justice, because justice for something like that does not exist in any form that fully satisfies. But it is something. It is a foundation. It is a beginning. I raised my hand to open the first motion. The chair recognized the human delegate. For the first time in 9 years, I did not feel like a piece of furniture.